We're live.
Okay, we're live. I guess we're live. We're getting started a little early. We're not actually getting started early. We're just making sure we got all our technological ducks in a row.
I'm responding to text messages already. So if you're not on Facebook, or if you're joining this as just a public event, if you don't have Facebook, then you may be limited on being able to comment or ask questions. So if you have my number or Bob's number, feel free to text, and we'll be happy to answer those questions, read them through that, which is what I'm doing right now. I'm already getting questions.
Well, it's nice to know there's at least a few people out there.
Someone's interested. The book went on sale at midnight last night. It's available on Smashwords, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Apple Books. Those are the four I have. Are there any other than I'm missing?
Nope, that's it.
Okay.
So far.
Yeah. I bought it on Apple Books at about 4 o'clock this morning. I got about 2 chapters in. It's great so far. So maybe some of you got a little farther than I did and have more in-depth questions. How many chapters are there?
I don't know, 60-some,
Okay.
I think, something like that.
Yeah. It was a good start.
Some of them are real short chapters and some are quite lengthy, so there's not, you read some books and it's like 20 or 30 pages and there's a new chapter every 20 or 30 pages. Some of them are real short and some of them are long. So.
Did you change the beginning multiple times, or was that
Yeah,
from
changed the beginning a lot. One of the things people say is you gotta have a bang up start to grab people's attention, and I didn't really have a bang up start, so I had to put something that was to come along later in the book. I divided that up and made the scenario that the book starts out with, that hopefully is a little bit of a bang up start. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
something to.
No, it's good. It's suspenseful. It gets you going. The part where the horse's head comes clean off, I was like, okay, maybe this is a bit fantastical. I thought it was going to be. With you, I didn't realize it was a dream until he wakes up.
Well, there you go. That's you want to read. Is that how did
I was
that
like, okay.
the horse's head come off? But our director is giving us
we gotta do
cues from.
Neither of us are lip readers.
Hold the cue cards a little higher. We can't see it. So we don't want dead airspace? Is that what you're saying? We want to keep talking?
6 minutes. I have 6 minutes till 2.
Okay.
Yeah. We're just chatting. This isn't official yet.
Yeah. You don't need
Off
to
the
pay
record.
attention. No notes. Don't be taking notes. This is off the record.
Any comments so far? Barb is on? Barb, write a comment. See if we can read it if it comes through. We're all Facebook Live novices. Brandon's on? Brandon, write a comment so we can see.
Steve
What?
Michael's on, and he wrote a comment and said,
I-
I'm here, Bob.
Good deal. This is not the book that I wanted you to read before. This isn't our military memoirs of my brothers and I. This is a completely different book. So.
Oh, wow. A whole nother series coming. Huh?
Not a series, another book, though. Another book of a different subject later on. If I can get my brothers on the ball.
Is that your nephew, Steve? Steve Michael?
No.
Steve Michael.
Steve Michael is a friend.
Friend from the service.
Cool. Nice. Comments are working. Great.
What did Barb say?
Looking good.
Looking good.
Question mark. You have a question? You have a question?
Hi, Jared.
Brandon.
And Brandon.
How do you know?
Mom's writing it down. I can
Oh.
see.
Dal is on.
Our director is writing
Dal's on,
it down.
Dal's on. Hi, Dal.
Are you gonna count down for us? How many takes do we get? So does anybody have a printed version?
Just me.
Okay.
We'll see about getting a printed version.
We've had a few questions already
Because
about
my
printed version.
brother Steve is not going to read it unless it's a printed version. He, I don't know how many times he told us, I like a book. I like a book.
I want to be able to smell the paper. I want to smell
Well,
the age.
you know, there's something about that. There's nothing that quite like the smell of an old book.
It's
I
not
agree.
old.
Well,
What's he gonna
well,
read it?
the smell of a new book with that fresh ink smell.
That's fair.
There probably will be a paperback though, Steve, I hope. We're not on yet, so.
We can't be here.
What?
We can't hear them.
Yeah, no, we can't hear you. So
Yeah.
if you have questions or comments, you can put them into the comment section. If you are watching publicly and you don't have access to Facebook, so if you're not signed in, or possibly if you don't have the app, then you may not have that comment option, in which case you can text Bob or I if you have questions or comments. But we can't see you, we can't hear you. From your end, it's all just typing in the comment section if you have questions or something you want to say. Oh, yay. Karen Engel wrote
Cindy's
that
on?
she got the book and already read 4 chapters and she's enjoying it.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Cindy's on. Great. Hi, Cindy. Long time no see. You got something to say, Mom? Kill him dead. Did I miss a message? Okay.
My director is my wife. We'll turn the camera around so you can see her. She's shooting daggers at me.
Jerry scribbles.
Jerry Thomas. Hi, Jerry. How are you doing? Glad you're joining us. Oh, dead air. We don't want dead air. 2 minutes.
Yeah, I already did that. 2 minutes.
And then the theme song will start.
Yes.
And then Skitch and the band over here will.
Yeah.
will,
Joanne Wilhelm will be soloing it. I know.
how's my hair? Well, my hair should be down. Is that what you're telling me? She went like this.
You need to comment. She may have been looking at me. One minute?
She said there's no makeup guy or girl to touch us up.
You
So
got nothing. It's,
it is what it is. You get what you see.
yeah, this is home videos. Quarantine times.
And that's one good thing. I mean, this is a good. I think might be a good time to release a book like this because you're staying home and hopefully you're staying home and not getting out too much. I know we're all getting crazy with staying at home, but this will help while away the hours maybe. However long it takes you to read. Days, maybe. If you're like me, it takes me days to get through a book. So.
Oh, that's pretty good. I thought that was fast.
Well, I read a couple
longer than
hours
that.
before I go to bed, and I read for a couple hours, or a couple of chapters, really, not a couple hours. Usually takes me, I don't know,
o'clock? It started? All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Christina Tippy, here to introduce my stepdad, Bob Wilhelm. Thanks for joining us. Today is the book launch of his first book, Warclouds on the High Plains. It's the first in a series of books of the Tales of the Sergeant Major. As of now, it's only available as an ebook. It went on sale at midnight today. You can check it out on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple Books, Smashwords. Let us know if you need any help finding it. I bought it this morning. I'm only on chapter 2, but maybe some of you finished it if you read faster than us. But we're looking forward to any of your questions. Our plan is to have Bob kind of talk about it, about how we got this book, and maybe even do some readings from the book. After that, we'll open it up for some questions and answers with Bob. I said a little earlier before we got started, we're only doing Facebook. YouTube wasn't working out for us as first-timers with our channel, and so if you're watching as a public video, you may not be able to write comments or questions. So feel free to shoot Bob or I a text. We've got our phones right here, so we're happy to field those questions live as well. Most of you already know Bob. Bob, my first memory of him was about 30 years ago at an event called Christmas Past. It's an event at the Old Fort Hays Museum, which is where this book takes place. Bob worked there for just shy of 29 years, and he was a curator of the museum for many of them. Christmas Past was one of the many living history events that the museum hosted. The volunteers would dress up and they would act as characters from the 1860s or 1890s. You would walk around the grounds, they would interact with you as they were live in that era. They went through painstaking details such as threading popcorn to create garland for these like Charlie Brown Christmas tree looking things. I remember that. I did not have the patience to do things like that. They also had, I always remember such beautiful memories. They had paper bags with real candles. I don't know how they got away from it. It was probably the 90s, but just with fire hazards and things like that. But it was just a really beautiful event. I think that the whole town enjoyed and still enjoys. I don't live in Hays anymore, so I don't get to enjoy it as often. But I remember Bob at the end of that event when we were leaving, he gave me a bag of oatmeal raisin cookies. So pretty much sealed my relationship with him as a kid, loving him. I think two easy character descriptions of Bob are dad jokes and storyteller, and I don't think anyone would argue with that. But it makes me trust that Sergeant Major's tales are going to be very entertaining. Bob spent a lot of years at the fort. I remember him researching people who lived at the fort in the city of Hays in the 1860s and 70s, and he shared his stories. In one of these events, it was called Graveside Conversations. It took place around Halloween, and he researched people who had died in Hays. So you would go to the fort, and then you would ride out to a dark field where volunteer ghosts were there, and you would go from one graveside to the next, and the volunteers would light up their lantern, and they would tell their stories of their life and how they died. And sometimes he would create a whole story, a character on a person just based off of their name and where they died and when they died. And he would actually know nothing about the person, but his expertise of knowing what the city was like during that time, the culture of the city, he could just create very believable characters. He just has a very broad knowledge of the town and the culture from the 1860s to the 1890s. In addition to his expertise of the whole background of this book, he also served in the Vietnam War, which I think it also helps with his authenticity of the military that is going on in these stories as well. There's so many reasons to be excited about this book. I am getting to really enjoy the realization of Bob's creativity, this goal that he's had for at least a decade. I remember him talking about it. His expertise of all of the years of research he did, and his storytelling genius that's now condensed into a book, a story for us to enjoy. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to share with us Sergeant Major.
Wow, thanks. this lives up to that. I don't really know where to start. We've been planning this for a while, and this release here, and I figure that people probably want to know why I wrote this book, particularly given the fact that I was involved in history for a long time. A lot of my contemporaries and so on, they were involved in history, and here I'm writing historical fiction. So I hope they don't feel that I've somehow jumped ship and joined the dark side or something. But I can almost unequivocally say that I've wanted to write stories all my life. Not quite all my life, maybe the first 10 years I wasn't quite aware of it, but when I remember the first story that I did write, I was in about the 3rd grade. My family, I have 2 older brothers and 2 younger sisters, and our dad was a high school or a secondary school educator and administrator, and he had gotten a job in a little town called Cullison in Kansas, and Cullison was really kind of a Mayberry experience. And for those of you who may be listening who are young enough, that doesn't mean anything to you. Ask Grandma and Grandpa what that Mayberry experience means. It was a small town, about 200 people or so, and the whole school from 1st grade to 12th grade was in one building. But we lived in a house. I have a bad habit of sidetracking myself, so somebody give me a clue here, a cue when I'm doing that. But we lived in a house, a 2-story house, and upstairs were 2 bedrooms. One bedroom on one end of the house, and the other on the other end. And my brother Dallas, he was the oldest, so he had a bedroom to himself. And Steve and I shared the other one, and there was a hallway connected the two. And in that hallway was the typewriter. And it was Dad's typewriter that he used for official things, and it was kind of the standard royal, as I remember it, gray typewriter sitting on a metal typing table with wheels and 2 drop leaf surfaces that you could pop up, and I was just fascinated by this typewriter and the keys jumping up and getting on the pages and making words and things, and I remember I don't know if it was Steve and I or maybe it was Cindy and I. Cindy was 4 years younger than I. Steve was 4 years older than I, but I have a memory of 2 of us playing around with that typewriter. Maybe it was just me, I don't know. But I pounded on that thing, and I got the keys stuck, and I probably bent a couple of them, and Dad was really mad at me, and I was forbidden to touch that from that point on. But every day I left the bedroom, I walked by this typewriter, and the technology of the period and everything, I just loved that typewriter. And so one day when Dad was gone, I went down and I formulated this plan. I went down and talked to Mom, and I said, I really want to write this story, and I really want to put it on the typewriter. And she finally gave in. She said, okay, but if you get anything messed up, you wait till your dad gets home. And I said, no, I'll be real careful. And I got my piece of paper and I ran up there and I spent I don't know how long on it, and came out with I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 sentences of this little bunny rabbit family and why the one wanted to be like his dad, and I pulled it out and it had all kinds of strike overs, and you had this typewriter eraser. It was a real hard rubber thing, and it actually took off a layer of paper when you did it. So if you had to erase the same spot more than once, it created a hole in the paper. And I'm sure I had a hole or 2 in the paper, but I was so proud of that. It's too bad it's probably not in our list of memorabilia that's tucked away someplace. But that was my first inkling of wanting to write, and and it continued through. Went to high school. We took a class. I took a class in composition, and it was there were two of my friends, Michael Brantley and Bob Booth, and I really liked to write anyway. So we wrote for more than just the class, and we shared stories, and a lot of them were science fiction, fantasy, humorous, silly things, and then after I graduated from high school, I continued to write kind of on my own for my own pleasure and stuff, and went to college, and didn't really want to go to college, but Dad said, you're going to college, so I went, and my heart really wasn't in it though, and after 3 semesters I flunked out. And this was in about 1969-70. In that time period, Vietnam was still going on, and the draft was after me, and I figured it would be a lot better than getting drafted into the Army. I enlisted in the Air Force and spent 3.5 years in the Air Force. Used the typewriter a lot in my job, which is a whole other story. So we'll get to that sometime. Steve Michael is a friend of mine from the service days, and he signed in here, and we'll get to that book eventually. But anyway, after my time in the service, I went back to college, got a master's degree in biology, and I've often wondered why I took that route rather than going into English or composition or literature or something. But biology's always been an interest of mine too. Dad was a biology teacher for a while, but I still took some literature classes in that period of college, and so I learned a little bit more about writing and how to do it and that sort of thing. And when I got out of college, I really wanted to go to a research college and work in a research museum, primarily studying mammals, but animals in general, but mammals in particular. And I got my degree, and I wanted a job like that, but the problem with jobs like that is that people don't get into those for the money. They get into them because they enjoy that work. It's kind of a passion for them, and so they get into those jobs, and they keep those jobs, and so you basically have to wait until somebody dies or retires to fill one of those positions, and so they don't come along all that often. And so I was looking around and trying to get a job just to survive, and this job came open at the Fort Hays Museum, and it wasn't a research museum, a biology museum, but it was a museum. So I took that job, and I am of the philosophy that we are where we are because of what we have done in the past, and we don't so much, I don't know that we necessarily create our own path, that we're led through this, and it's not a question of fate has things in store for you, as you're being you are where you're supposed to be going. God takes you in certain directions, and I know that if I hadn't taken that job with the Fort Hays Museum, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have written this book. So I took this job and didn't know anything about history, museum work, or anything like that. But I kind of got into it, and then right after I took the job, they organized a friends group, which is a group of people that a lot of museums and places have friends groups, where there are volunteers or there are people who just want to support the museum, and they had a newsletter. They created a newsletter. And when I got to be the director 3 or 4 years after I started that job, I became the director of the museum, and I gladly took over the reins of that newsletter and began researching people at the museum or at the fort and that kind of thing. And when I eventually we started giving guided tours, and I don't know if anybody from the museum was watching, but I had a kind of a reputation there. Most of the time the tour guides would go out and they lead people around the museum, and they'd be back in 20 minutes, And if I found a group that was in any way showed any interest, I might be out there for an hour and a half. Hopefully I didn't bore them all silly, but I got a lot of questions back and stuff, and so I think a lot of people were interested, although there were a few people who kind of wandered off, got tired of listening to me. But anyway, I was more interested in not, here's this building, and this is how it was built, when it was built, and okay, let's go to the next one, as these are the people who lived in this building. And I just found that it was more interesting to me to tell them stories about the people at the fort and not the physical structures or anything like that. Kind of use the structures as a vehicle to get into those stories. And so that's kind of where this whole idea was born, is that Fort Hays had a lot of interesting stories. I'm sure that anybody who works at any of these forts, my friend George Elmore down at Larned probably knows more about Fort Larned in this whole time period than anybody that I've ever met. Certainly Fort Larned, he knows more about Fort Larned than anybody, but I'm sure that he knows the people who were there. And that's kind of the essence of this. When I retired in 2013, I decided that I wanted to do something that I'd always wanted to do. And my wife was still working at the time. My wife's the director here this afternoon, behind the camera. And she gave me the freedom to spend a couple of hours, anywhere from half an hour to 4 hours in the afternoon at the local coffee shop. So I owe a lot to her. I owe a lot to the folks at Mocha's coffee place there in Hays, because I spent a lot of time there just sitting down writing. And I had an idea of how this whole thing was going to go. I wanted it to be something that I could have fun with. And if it ever did get published, I wanted other people to have fun with it too. And so I found that my original idea about this had this one particular character, and then a couple of other characters over here, and they got to talking and doing this. And the more I tried to bend those characters to go the way I wanted to, the harder it was to do. But if I just sat back and just started writing, they would, this is going to sound silly probably to a lot of people, but those characters started talking to me. They started telling me what was going on, what they were actually thinking, what they were doing. And so a lot of the fiction of this book is a result of them taking me in the direction that they wanted to go, telling their story the way they wanted it to be told. And you can believe that or not, but that's how I did it. And I found that I kind of wanted to write a book, but after about 100,000, 150,000 words, I realized this was not even close to being done, and so I had to divide it up into sections. And this is the first of those sections. And it's going to be at least a tetralogy. It's going to be at least 4 books in the series, and who knows how far it will go. But I've already got the second one pretty much done. I need to go through the editorial process, which is going to take a while to get that done. So maybe around Christmas time or the first of next year, we'll have the second installment of it. But that's kind of the essence of the simple answer was I always wanted to do this, and as you know, if you know me very well, I don't have simple answers. I have to go on and on and on about things, and so that's where I've gone to this point. I don't want me to read a little section of the book. I've got a few sections that I just kind of randomly chose. Let's see if I can get to them here. And this is from early on in the book, and it tells a little bit about Sergeant Major Thomas Barrett. And there really was a guy named Thomas Barrett at Fort Hays, and he was a sergeant major. We don't know anything about him other than he was a sergeant major and he was at Fort Hays at the very end of the fort's fight. Some of the characters in this story, their names have been changed, but some of them have not. Some of them are the real names. And this is this is how Thomas Barrett described himself. Thomas Barrett gave his gray-flecked handlebar mustache a twist on each end and removed his watch from his pocket. He pressed down on the stem and the cover popped open. 8:27, 33 minutes until parade. He gave himself one more look in the looking glass on the wall and said in a whisper, "You are dismissed, Sergeant Major. Report for dress parade." Executing a perfect about face, he walked smartly to the door. He was one of only a few enlisted men on post who had his own quarters. It came with the rank. He was more than just a soldier. As Sergeant Major of the 18th Regiment of Infantry, he was ultimately responsible for all the enlisted men in the regiment. Of course, the other non-commissioned officers had some of those same responsibilities as well, but the Sergeant Major oversaw them all. His job was mostly administrative, yet he felt a great responsibility for the conduct and deportment of the men under his command. His only regret in achieving the rank was that his job would not allow him as much interaction with the men as he would like. He was a personable man and craved the one-on-one interaction with the men, seeking out opportunities to talk with the men, meet new recruits, observe their activities, and advise and correct when and where necessary. Some of the NCOs would no doubt consider this an intrusion on their duties, but for him it was his way of leading by example. They would just have to adapt. And so that tells you a little bit about the Sergeant Major. He's a very spit and polish character, and it's important that you know that he really craved that interaction with the soldiers, because a Sergeant Major, as is told in that little paragraph there, he's really more into an administrative thing. He's left the soldiers' everyday operations behind, and he takes a look at all the men in the regiment and reports to the commanding officers and the company commanders and the regimental commander and the vice commander and so on. And normally the Sergeant Major would not have anything to do with what goes on in the story here. So you got to, for those of you, if George Elmore is watching, you just suspend your disbelief here. Suspend your belief in the Sergeant Major and what he normally would do and what he's going to be doing in this story here. But he's a student of history, and he's been at Fort Hays before when he was with some other regiments, and so he imparts some of this history of the fort to the men who he finds there, who he feels need his help, and he tries to he does turn them into, eventually, I guess I shouldn't have said that because it kind of takes away from the suspense of the final books, but there are 5 guys who are about ready to get dismissed from the Army as undesirable, and he takes them under his wing and he starts to teach them things. And one thing that he found one thing that he finds that has a real connection with the men is he tells them about what went on at the fort in years past, and that's where a lot of this story comes from. It's kind of a difficult book for me to describe, because it doesn't just have one storyline and a mystery, and you find the end, and solve the mystery, and that's the end of the story. There's the storyline with the Sergeant Major and his recruits, his 5 guys that he's working with, but he tells these stories, and so there's a collection of short stories within this novel, and so you're not just getting one story, you're getting 4 or 5 stories every book. So hopefully that will be interesting. I'm going to go to another reading, or do you have any questions or anything?
No questions. Stephen Michael comment he's impressed that you're an author and an actor.
Thanks, Steve. Well, you know, you do what you can. Here is one of the other stories that I picked out 3 readings, and this is from one of the stories within the story that where there is an officer and his wife who are leaving from Fort Wallace, which is way out in western Kansas, and his wife is very unhappy, and he takes her back to eventually Fort Riley, goes through Fort Fletcher, which was the forerunner of Fort Hays. But anyway, this is a story from the section named titled J.T. Wilson. But it's not about necessarily Wilson as it is. Well, I'm just going. Why must we continue to live in this horrid tent? Renee, dearest, Lieutenant Vance said from behind a worn copy of Harper's Weekly. As I told you before, the men have not been able to build us a shelter due to the conditions of food and weather. Food and weather, food and weather, is that all you can say? You're an officer. You should order the lackeys to do that. But dearest, they have had so little to eat. They've gotten plenty since the supply train arrived. They have, but they must have time to regain their strength, dearest. Would you please put that newspaper down while I'm talking to you? She practically yelled. My dearest Renee, Mr. Davis has sent enough to give me this paper before, was nice enough to give me this paper before, and he and the other, my dearest Renee, Mr. Davis was nice enough to give me this paper before he and the others left for Denver, and it contains news from the States that I'm sure even you would find of interest. I cannot stand this wretched place one moment longer, she said as tears began to drip down her cheeks. Oh, now, please, my sweetness, don't let your emotions get the better of you. Just put another couple of buffalo chips in the stove and go back to your sewing. All will be well once you get warm. This takes place, obviously, in the middle of winter. Oh, she squealed as tears suddenly fell in buckets. I am totally and absolutely alone here. Why, oh, why did I ever agree to come with you on this lost expedition? I am destined to die here alone, scalped and ravished by the savages and left to freeze in this endless prairie. Oh, why didn't I listen to my mother and not marry an army man? Dearest, what are you saying? You're not alone and you will not die here on the prairie. Can we go back, Jimmy? Please, the supply train will be heading back tomorrow. Oh, please, please ask the Major if we can go back by then. But I am needed here, dearest. Please, Jimmy. Please, I will never complain about anything ever again. I pledge on my soul I won't. Lieutenant Vance looked at his wife, knowing she would never keep that pledge. He had asked her to accompany him on this expedition only because he feared she would leave him if she stayed at Fort Riley alone. She never liked living in the field, and he was certain she would refuse to leave the comfortable and well-equipped Riley, where she had made several friends among the officers' wives. Yet, to his utter surprise, she agreed to come along. Why, he had not the slightest clue. He did love her, perhaps more than she loved him, and he could not stand to see her unhappy. Very well, dearest, I shall ask. Now dry those tears. Here, look over the paper while I'm gone. Lieutenant Vance to see the Major, he announced to the private outside the Major's hut. One moment, sir, the private knocked and was admitted and returned in just a few seconds. The Major will see you now, sir, he said as he held the door for the officer. Lieutenant Vance, what can I do for you? Well, Major, I wondered if it might be acceptable for my wife and I to return to Fort Riley with the supply train tomorrow. Permission granted. You see, sir, my wife is rather unhappy here and my duties are minimal now that the post... I said permission granted, Lieutenant. What? Vance had anticipated a difficult time convincing the Major to agree to the request. Permission granted. You will report to the commander at Fort Fletcher and await further orders. I will detail an escort to go along with you, so you will have some protection. God be with you, Lieutenant. Dismissed. Well, thank you, Vance stammered as he was ushered out of the door. Major Pritchard let out a sigh of relief as soon as the lieutenant walked out. It would be nice not having to put up with the constant complaining of the lieutenant's wife. The lieutenant's tent might keep the elements out, but it did not keep the human voice in, and the major's gunny sack door to his hut provided no barrier either. With the arrival of the McGrath's company, he had plenty of men to accomplish the job he had been sent here to perform. Second lieutenants and women he did not need. So that leads to a trip back from Fort Wallace east to Fort Fletcher. And a lot of these stories, they're historical fiction, and so there is history involved in it. And there is, even though this trip is a fictional trip with a fictional lieutenant and his fictional wife, there are stories that you will read in here, there are incidents that you will read in this that are historical fact. And in this particular story, I won't tell you the whole story, but there is an incident with a mule, and it sounds fantastical, and it is quite humorous, I think, but it actually happened. And there's another story in another section, which I won't read, but it has to do with a doctor who was a real person. This was a real description of this Dr. Whipple. And so when you get to that section, again, that was all taken from historical facts. So that's an interesting story. This particular book ends with the final story is about Elizabeth Custer, who was at Fort Fletcher, Fort Hayes. It became renamed Fort Hayes, and she was there during a very severe storm. And it was fun to write this. A lot of it is based on Mrs. Custer's recollections. But it was fun to write this because Christina, who was just here, had just gotten married. And David, her husband, is a meteorologist. And so that got me to thinking, there was a storm that hit Fort Hayes, and it lasted all night. And it had terrible thunder and terrible lightning. And it got me to thinking, I've never been through a storm, anything like that lasted all night. I mean, it lasted like 8 or 9 hours. And so I started researching a little bit about weather history and so on. And I came up with what I think is a pretty legitimate scenario for what kind of storm this was. And cold air comes from the Pacific Northwest, and it goes over the Rocky Mountains and it gets colder, and it comes zooming down, and it clashes with some warm air that was coming from across Wyoming and Montana, and it creates this huge series of thunderstorms and supercells and so on. And as they were driving across the plains, the front storm would rage, and then it would kind of die on the leading edge of the storm. But on the trailing edge of the storm, there would be more weather, and it would build up, and so it was just a wave of these storms coming in. And from my opinion, or I'm not, but anyway, I had David look this over as a weather person. I said, does this sound legitimate? Does this sound real? And he said, yeah, it does. And so throughout this particular section, I talk about the storm and how the storm forms. And so it's you kind of go from being in 1867, western Kansas, Fort Hayes, and then in italics is all of the science that goes along with this storm. And so we're picking this up where the storm is approaching and finally hits the fort. And this is one of my descriptions of the storm. The storm was moving steady and strong now. If there had been any chance it would miss the fort, that chance was long gone. Soon the booms that were heard were not runaway bass drums. Earlier, the drummer had dropped a bass drum and it created quite a noise. Were not runaway bass drums. The thunder began to come in rapid volleys of cloud artillery, and the blinding lightning produced an incessant fire that illuminated the interiors of the canvas tents. And then the heavens loosed their rains in torrents. The ground, still muddy from recent rains, could hold little more, and the water soon began to run downward toward the valley of the creek. Trees began to bend unnaturally from the force of the strong, cold winds in the downdrafts, and an unearthly howl arose from the tortured trees, causing the men and women of the garrison to search their souls for any mortal sin they may have committed that had brought such a terrible tempest to their small camp. "Is there nothing we can do? No one to help us?" cried Diana to Libby as the two women huddled together beneath the quilts on their cots. Libby, for those who don't know, was Elizabeth Custer's name that George Custer gave her. And he had been at the fort, and she came out to the fort to be with him. And he was on the trail of some Indians and had got stopped at Fort Hays. He was very upset with the whole thing until supplies came, and then he left, and he was going up north into Nebraska and across Nebraska, and he came down through Colorado and back to the fort. And Elizabeth Libby wanted to stay at Fort Hays for when he came back. He wanted her to go back to Fort Riley, but she wouldn't do it. And so she was there, and he had made a very strong tent for her that would, according to him, stand up to anything. And Diana was a friend of hers that she brought out with her, a very young, beautiful little girl, and was quite happy to be the subject of attention from all the young unmarried officers in the area. But anyway, they huddled beneath their cots. "It would do no good," Libby called back to her. "The tents are too far away. No one would hear us. Tents have no soundproofing, and so in order to preserve a modicum of privacy, the tents of Libby and Diana, as well as an A-frame for Eliza, who was their servant, another for the orderly, and another large wall tent for Captain Barnett's and Captain Albert and Jenny Barnett's, were placed on a small rise some yards from the officers across a small divide, a natural swale in the land's contours. "Mrs. Custer, Miss Diana, are you all right?" "Wait," said Diana. "Did you hear that?" Libby could hear little above the storm's din, and in fact the two women had to virtually shout at one another to be heard, and they were just inches apart. "Quiet," commanded Libby. "Ladies, are you afraid?" "It's one of the officers," said Libby. The two women covered themselves with robes, lit a tallow candle and a brass candlestick, and went to unbuckle the straps of their outer tent. Lieutenant Charles Breach, newly arrived at the fort, and Lieutenant Brewster, followed by Eliza, were literally blown into the tent by sheets of cold rain and wind that promptly blew out the candle. Once the wind took hold of the tent flaps, it did not easily let go, but between the five, they managed to resecure them, although somewhat loosely. As if angry that it had lost the battle, the wind wrenched the rain cover over the tent and tent fly at the front of the tent and flapped them against the canvas. "What's happening?" asked the worried Diana. "The storm is bearing down on us," said Brewster. "The tent stakes are coming loose. I'm not sure how much longer your tent will last." Although a shallow trench had been dug around the perimeter of the tents to shunt water away from this storm was producing more than the trenches could handle. Water was now running under the canvas and through the tent. Breach looked at the ridgepole swaying and commented, "I'm not sure this ridgepole will last either." So this is right before the storm, and again, a lot of history here. And as the water comes up, the Elizabeth Custer is in very grave danger of being washed away, and this was something very keen on the minds of the other officers who were left at the post, that to have to explain to General Custer, a famous man in his day, when he came back, that his wife had been swept away in the flood and they were alive. So it was a very traumatic thing, and there's a lot of history in that. too. So there's a few excerpts from the book. Do we have any questions?
Yeah,
or
we do
anything
have
like
some
that?
questions.
Okay, great.
So, Jared Tippy wanted to know when the audiobook is available. And Tony said, yes, she wants you to agree with it. And Steve Michael also wants the audiobook. So,
Okay, well, we're working with Sean Connery and the Cumberbach guy to see if they're interested in doing. Now there is an option to do an audiobook, and we're going to be looking into that just like the hardcover book, but it's not available yet. But hopefully in the near future.
yeah, I think that'd be excellent. You're very good at reading your characters. Your sister Cindy asked, do you think you got your gift of telling stories from your father?
Probably. My dad was a good storyteller, and he was a good practical joker too. I have a lot of stories on him. I'm just sorry that he and Mom weren't here to see this.
Dal and Carol asks if you write longhand or on computer, and Kim Perino also thought that was a good question to ask if you still use the typewriter. As a young girl, she shared your fascination with the typewriter, and using it was an honor and privilege.
No, I find that backspace button on the computer is really good. You don't have to erase or retype the whole thing, and I do it on. I started out on a little a laptop hand-me-down actually from Christina, and eventually then we got the iPads, and I got a little keyboard that goes along with it, and now that's what I use.
Amanda asks, when you worked at the Fort Hayes, you had a golf cart that you named Sarge. Was that named after Sergeant Major? Was the character already in your mind?
No, that was I just one of the I read a lot of books, and that's one of the things that I think is mainly the tribute to our mother, because I remember when we moved into Sterling, which is another little kind of it was an 1890s kind of a town. I think when we first moved there, it was a real hometown kind of place. Went to high school, junior high and high school there, and I remember the first thing that Mom did when we moved in there is she took us kids down to the library. Dal was away at college, so he wasn't part of that, but she took us down to the library and got us library cards. And so we've been reading our whole life. Our whole family reads a lot. And I've sidetracked myself. I've forgotten the question.
Sarge.
Yeah, Sarge. But I read a lot of fiction, obviously, but I also read a lot of historical stuff, particularly military stuff, World War II. And our father was in the Army Air Corps and flew on B-17s and B-24s and even some B-29s and so on. And I was always fascinated by the fact that a lot of these airplanes had names, and there's the Vargas Girl ones and all that kind of stuff, but there's all kinds of other names that people, and I remember Dad telling us one time that he flew in a squadron that had as its motto the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So the airplanes were named after the one was Snow White, and the other seven were the dwarf names, and they had figures painted on them and stuff like that. And so that when I got this golf cart, just because there were events that went on, and as the director when an event went on, you were always putting out fires. You were, somebody over here didn't like their place, and so you had to move them, and somebody over here needed water, and so you were running back and forth, and it was just pretty tiring. And so I got this golf cart, and I just figured the golf cart needs a name, and I thought, well, Sarge, that's a good name, Sarge. And then what kind of an image can you put on there? And it had to be family friendly and all that. And so I was looking through some things, and I saw a Disney cartoon, and it had this cartoon version of a horse, and I thought, there's Sarge right there. And so no, it wasn't anybody in the book, although, you know, I could put somebody like that in the book. Had a horse face or something. But no, that was fun, and so we used Sarge for quite a number of years, and then I sold it to Jared, and he apparently gave it to his mother-in-law, and so Sarge now has a little flower thing, and you know, so anyway.
Dal and Carol ask how long you write each day.
Anywhere from you gotta. I found that you gotta do at least an hour, because it takes at least a half an hour to get back. Even if you were just writing like crazy and everything was falling into place, and then it's time for supper, and so you go home and you eat supper, and you go back the next day. It takes you a while to get back into the rhythm of things, and so if I write. It's got to be at least an hour, but it varies with what's going on, and sometimes when Joanne had a meeting or something and I didn't have to go home for supper, I might sit there for 4 or 5 hours and write. It just depends on how things are flowing, but got to be at least an hour, but to get back into it.
So you said some of your characters you changed names and some of them you didn't. How did you decide which characters?
Originally, I had all the names. Almost everybody was an actual character. If I wanted a name, I got out. Connie Schmeigler did a lot of research on did a lot of transcription of the Fort records, and so we had them on computer files, and I got a copy of that. And if I needed a name, and it was in a cavalry unit. I went to the cavalry unit and started reading names and just found somebody that I liked and started using them. And then I thought, well, you know, if this is going to be out there in the public, and this one particular character turns out in the story to be kind of a bad character, or had some bad qualities or something. You don't want their descendants coming up and saying, well, my great-great-great-grandfather wasn't like that. And so you kind of have to change a few things. And there's some, some well-known people like Custer's, obviously use their names. But there are a lot of just kind of anonymous things. I mean, if somebody out there reads it and they say, well, that sounds like somebody from my family, and they research, I'd like to know about them. And this this is not written in stone, particularly being in a computer, and go in and change any of that and redo the book. So, but I didn't want to offend anybody. I didn't want anybody to get offended by something that I might have said or something, because a lot of these people, I don't know that much about them. They're just in the Fort records, and so you just use their name, and so that's, some of the names are changed and some of them aren't. So it just I guess it's my own decision.
Creative liberties.
Yeah.
Dal and Carol ask if you work from an outline.
Everything I've read says, if you're going to write, you got to write an outline. And I guess my outline is up here, which is probably one of the reasons that it takes me at least half an hour to get into things. But I don't, and I've kind of tried that a couple of times. But like I was saying earlier, I could have this outline, and okay, now I'm supposed to talk about this particular character. But if that character, it's not his time to speak, his or her time to speak, then, I don't know. An outline hasn't really worked for me up to this point. So maybe in the future if I get into something else. But the story that I alluded to earlier about in the military, experiences. I did talk to Dal, and I talked to Dallas, and I talked to Steve, my brother Steve, and he was in the Marines. Dallas was in the Navy. I was in the Air Force, and so we've got our individual memories and so on of that, and it'd be hard to put all that down in an outline. But I guess in a way, I started that all out with a simple letter, and then I realized that, oh well, this was in Da Nang and this was in Ubon, so I'm gonna have to separate those two and that sort of thing. So even that I didn't really do an outline on it. I just kind of winged it, I guess. Maybe it's not the way that
Kevin.
Stephen King and those write, but
Kevin? Okay, I think
Kevin had a question.
oh, I'm here.
Mhm.
There's a question I missed.
Right after Dow.
Let me see. Kevin asked, you mentioned that this will be a series. Do you have any idea of how many books will be in the series and how many years will the series cover for the characters?
I assume this is Kevin Merriman. Hi, Kevin. Another one of my service buddies. I'm glad that you got the message. There will be at least 4. I've got at least 4 books in me, I think, for this series. And I mean, I could go on and on, I guess, but because a lot of these characters not only served in the Indian Wars out west, but then they stayed in the Army and they went to the Philippines, and so you know, it could go that far. But at this point, just 4 stories in it. And what was there's 2 parts to that question? Did I answer the other?
How many years will the series cover for the characters?
Oh, well, some of the backstories of some of these characters dates back to about 1865, and the main characters that are in Sergeant Barrett and the 5 guys, Houlihan, Love, Bowser, Duck. His last name was Duck, and 5th guy's gonna be mad at me. I can't remember his name. They are in the 1880s, but they are just entering the Army in the 1880s, and Barrett and some of his contemporaries were in the Army during the Civil War, 1860. Actually, so it's even before that, 1860 to about 1889 or so, when Fort Hays was closed. So it takes a good number of years.
Brandon asks, do you have any interest in doing historical nonfiction next?
You know, that's one of the things that I could have very easily done. I could have written a story about Fort Hays, but this guy right back here has done a pretty good job. Leo Oliva, historian, has written, this is a booklet, and there's way more about Fort Hays' history than can fit into a small book like this, but Leo's a very good historian, and I could do that kind of stuff, but I want to show you this. Okay. One of the authors that I really like, and I started getting into from an early time when I was working at the fort, was this man here, Captain Charles King. He was at Fort Hays. He was stationed at Fort Hays for a brief period of time, and he was in the Army. He was in the 6th Cavalry, I believe, and he was severely wounded in a battle, and he had to be medically retired. And what he did was he started writing historical novels. And he wrote a whole bunch of them. He was a very popular author. This happens to be a couple of them, Trooper Ross and Signal Butte, a couple of books in one volume here. And he was an extremely popular author back in the 1890s and early 1900s because he wrote a lot. He was right up there with Dickens and all those. Well, Dickens was earlier than that, but I mean, he had a huge following. And by today's standards, you can look at this and you can say, well, the stories are rather contrived and they're romances, basically. Almost every one of them has the same kind of story about a soldier meeting a woman, and then, man finds woman gets mad at the man or whatever, and then they come back and they get married or whatever, and that's the way most of them are. But if you, a lot of people have said, a lot of researchers and so on have said that if you want to know, even though these were fiction, Captain King's novels were fiction, if you want to know what life was like in the Army during the 1860s to the 1880s or 1890s, one of the premier ways to do that is to read Charles King's books, because there's a lot of history involved in his books. And in fact, this book right back here, I'm surrounded by some of the books here that have helped me because I find I want to put something in there, like the soldiers go to the trader store at Fort Hays, and the post trader gives Sergeant Barrett a cold beer, and that got me to think, when did they start making cold beer? And so I get in and look at some of these books and some other history books and so on to find out this little thing here that you could just say, well, and they had a cold beer. This was the first cold beer I had, out on the plains. But there's a lot of history into that, and if you look at Charles King's books, you find a lot of that history. It's very historically accurate as far as how people, and this guy here, Oliver Knight, wrote Life and Manners in the Frontier Army, which is all based. This is stuff taken from the Charles King novels, and it tells in here just how people behaved and what how women and men reacted with one another, and that kind of stuff, because things were very different back in the Victorian period when back there was being an old saying where women were women and men were men, and that kind of thing, and you didn't have too many women who were running around in pants and doing the Calamity Jane kind of thing. I mean, history was different back then, and so you may find some of this in some of the books that you might be a woman who today reads this and says, well, that woman was just being taken advantage of, and probably, but that's the way things were back in those days, and I try to leave a little bit of that out. I mean, I don't want to, there were strong women back then. If you look at the suffrage movement and all that, there were strong women. In fact, that's one of the things I'm working on right now, is a segment where there's a suffragette that comes to the fort, and so, but anyway, I could write another history book, but there are people who write history books a lot more knowledgeable than I. If you want to know about Fort Hays, I'm your guy. But if you want to know about the Indian Wars out west and a lot of the details of that, I know about Fort Hays, and I obviously know about things that happened in the West during this time period. But I just think that for me to sit down and write a history book, I could probably do that. but it wouldn't be as fulfilling for me. I wanted to do something that was fun, that was enjoyable, where I could use my imagination. That's what I've got, a very vivid imagination. My wife tells me that all the time. I've got a very vivid imagination, and so I like to use that. I've been doing. I did the history thing for almost 30 years, and I'm ready to do this for the next 30 years. So probably not too much history, other than our Vietnam experiences for my brothers and I.
Great. We have, if anybody has any other comments or questions to get in, we're on our last one now. Tom Bodine asked, who created your book cover?
That was probably one of the hardest parts of this. In order to, I went through Smashwords, which is a company that markets books. It doesn't really cost you anything. They get a lot of their money through ads, and they get a small portion of the sales of your book and so on. But in order to get the book, I mean, I wrote the book, and then it has to be formatted. It's formatted in a particular computer program that Smashwords could use to market it to other, like Barnes and Noble and all that. And in order to submit that, you had to have a cover. And I had never done it. I wasn't qualified to do a cover. I don't know what a cover is supposed to be. And on Smashwords, it had a list of, if you don't want to do your own cover, here's some people who do covers. And there are people who do covers for a living, artists who do book covers. And you can they'd either do photographs, they can use publicly available photographs and put things together, or they can draw it, or they can do whatever. And I found one that I just thought, okay, I'm just going to give her a try. And Tatiana Villa or something. Yeah, Tatiana Villa. She has a company. Look her up. She got a lot of pretty neat covers. And when I contacted her, I didn't have any idea what to do. I just knew that the purpose of the cover for an ebook is to draw your attention to it. And when people are looking through the list of books on Barnes and Noble or whatever, here's a list of the new books. The first thing they see is the cover, and if they don't like the cover, they probably won't read what you've written. And that's about all I knew about it. It had to be something striking, and I wanted something that was going to be different and eye-catching and that sort of thing. And Tatiana and I had, we went around and around here because I didn't really know what I wanted, and she didn't really know what I wanted. And so we tried a few things, and she, I don't think, had ever done a book cover like mine, the subject matter, before. And I said, okay, for instance, I wanted a cannon. I wanted a Civil War cannon here. Well, she didn't put a Civil War cannon. She put a World War I cannon. And maybe most people wouldn't notice that, but I would notice that. And, George Elmore would notice that. And Lee Waller would notice that. But most people probably wouldn't notice that. But I wanted it to be right. And so I had some suggestions, and they just weren't working out. And finally, I just said I was ready to go somewhere else, and I just kind of threw up my hands and I said, "Just do whatever. I've already paid you. Just do whatever you want." And she wrote back, and she was equally frustrated with me. And she said, "Let's give it one more try," basically. And so she came up with this image, and we had used a storm. I said, well, it's going to be Warclouds, so let's do a storm. And her storm clouds were just storm clouds, and I wanted something more dramatic of a storm cloud. And so I looked through public images to try to find a sunset or a sunrise that had a storm in it. And so I found some red storms. And she was big on silhouettes. She wanted silhouettes. She said silhouettes are very eye-catching, and her silhouettes just weren't doing it for me. And I thought, well, the blockhouse is interesting. It's a very distinctive looking building, and so I suggested that to her, and she put a soldier in there. He didn't have the right. I mean, it was just a silhouette, but he didn't have the right uniform or anything. And this is pretty close here. It's a Civil War type uniform, and so she said, "Well, just try this," and she just threw it out there, and it was the blockhouse in with this silhouette and the dramatic lightning bolts and all that kind of stuff, and then the army down here in the bottom, and these and it kind of was the essence of this. The Warclouds that the title refers to is not the war between the army and the Native Americans, the American Indians on the plains. That's part of it, but there was this war or a battle between this woman and her husband getting back from Fort Wallace to Fort Fletcher, and there's the battle between the soldiers and Mrs. Custer and this storm that comes in. That was a battle, and that's kind of the essence of this whole thing here is that the war clouds are storm clouds, and it's storm clouds rising sort of thing, and so it tells a little bit about the whole essence of the book without too much detail and that sort of thing. And the next volume, I'm not really sure what it's going to be called, but it may be something like Storm Clouds, because there is conflict in all this, and that's what kind of drives the story through things is this conflict, and it's not just always a conflict between adversaries like the Indians and the soldiers, or the Indians and the whites. It's conflict with Mother Nature. It's conflict within ourselves, that sometimes we know what we want to do, but we don't know how to do it, or we don't really want to do that, and so your conscience is working on you, and that sort of thing. And so each of these stories has a little bit of that conflict. There's a conflict with the main story with Barrett and the 5 soldiers, and then each one of these other stories has conflict involved in it. So I don't know. I don't know this experience in getting in the book cover. I don't know if that's going to help or hurt in the next one, but maybe Tatiana and I can work together and get another one. I don't know. I'll have to see.
I think we've hit all of our questions. Bob and Paula said hi, enjoyed seeing you.
Hi.
Great, this was so fun. Thanks everyone for joining us. Feel free to leave more comments on the Facebook page. Again, the book's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple Books, and Smashwords since midnight last night. So get on, read it, write your reviews, give us your comments. Love to hear your feedback.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah.